I heard my wife say on the phone, "I'll meet you later, honey," and in that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't the sound of the sentence, but the naturalness with which she said it, like someone saying goodbye to someone close, dear, with whom they share secrets and desires. The soft, almost childish tone she used with me in the first months of dating. She hung up without noticing my presence and went to the bedroom, humming. I remained motionless in the corridor, feeling the lack of air, as if the world around me had fallen silent. Everything seemed intact on the surface, but chaos had just settled inside me. I took a deep breath. I didn't say anything. I just decided I would follow the next steps with surgical precision. When I saw her come out of the garage half an hour later, wearing that dress that for years she had said she saved for special occasions, I understood that that night would have meaning. And perhaps it was the last one for our marriage. She came across as someone carrying a secret in her eyes, but also with the lightness of someone who believes she is successfully deceiving. I followed her. And what I saw at the end of that silent chase was what no man should see from the woman he chose to love for life. The two were together, like a couple newly in love. Laughter, discreet touches, complicit glances. She looked at him like she hadn't looked at me in months. And he treated her with the confidence of someone who knows he's not being betrayed, which, ironically, he was too. The pain didn't come all at once. It built up, like layers of heavy concrete being poured onto my chest. The next day, she kissed me when she woke up, as if nothing had happened. And over the next few weeks, he pretended to be normal. He talked about children, plans, trips. He made plans with me while I made love to him. And I, silent, pretended not to know, pretended not to notice. But I wrote everything down. Every detail. Every lie. Every excuse she made to get away from home. I turned my pain into a strategy. I didn't scream, I didn't confront, I didn't cry. I planned. I planned a divorce that wasn't just a legal breakup, but a blow that was as quiet as it was sure. I didn't want just any revenge, I wanted an eternal scar. I started putting everything together behind the scenes. I separated documents, reviewed joint accounts, consulted lawyers. And more than that, I went to the past. I rummaged through the memories she had tried to bury, searched our connections, and, by a quirk of fate, or by divine justice, I discovered that the man she slept with was married. And his wife, the woman he cheated on with mine, had also been cheated on before. We two had more in common than anyone could imagine. When I looked for her, she didn't want to believe it. But it took 3 videos, 2 screenshots of messages and an audio in which my wife said, "I want more next time," for reality to collapse between the two of us. She cried, I held back the tears. And there, at that moment, we sealed a pact. Not revenge, but justice. A poetic justice. While my wife believed that everything was on track, while she made elaborate dinners and called me, "my love," as if she were skilled in the art of acting, I organized the perfect act. She didn't suspect anything. She felt too comfortable lying. I was safe, immersed in my bubble of illusions, thinking that I would emerge unscathed, that I would return from meetings with my lover and that, at the end of it all, my presence would still be guaranteed. But I expected. I waited for the right moment. For the right impact. For the day her world would fall apart with one breath. The date arrived like a trap. She thought it was a dinner to celebrate our wedding anniversary. He ordered a reservation at a refined restaurant. He wore the same perfume as our first date. He smiled as if he still loved me. And she took her cell phone in her bag, already configured with messages ready for her lover. But before we could leave the house, I handed him an envelope. Inside were the divorce papers, evidence of the betrayal, and a handwritten letter, saying that she could leave right now, but not to have dinner with me. That the car she was using was in my name and had already been collected. That the apartment we lived in had been transferred into my legal name months before. That the accounts had been dismembered. That her lover had been exposed to his wife, and that he was now facing legal action. And that his wife, now ex, was at the door of our house, waiting for the two of us to leave together. She screamed. He tried to deny it. He cried. He fell to his knees. He asked to talk. He said it was a mistake, that it was a temporary thing, that he still loved me. But I, with the serenity that only prolonged pain can teach, just said that it wasn't about love, it was about respect. And that love dies when respect is buried. She even tried to stop me from leaving. But when she saw the woman her lover had been married to, with her arms crossed at the door, staring at her with the strength of someone who has suffered too much, she understood that the tables had turned. And that all the pawns had been removed from the board without her noticing. In the following days, I was called cold, calculating, cruel. But anyone who doesn't feel the pain of betrayal will never understand the coldness of those who survived it. When someone breaks you into pieces, the least you can do is return the silence. A silence so well constructed that it turns into a deafening scream. And that's exactly what I did. When she tried to call me to talk, to clarify, to close cycles, I was already in another country, rebuilding my life, writing my story far from the plot that she had tried to write over mine. I didn't look back. I didn't respond to messages. I didn't accept calls. I disconnected from what we were to reconnect with what I could be. I found, in the midst of chaos, a new chance to start over, not with revenge, but with dignity. And more than that, I found love. Genuine love. Mutual respect. A relationship without lies, where a sweetheart doesn't sound like betrayal, but like tenderness. Now, looking back on everything, I realize that sometimes betrayal comes like a storm, but it carries seeds. And when the mud drains, you can plant a garden. But what happened after that, the way she reacted when she saw that she lost everything, including her lover, who discarded her like someone discarding a used glass, and how fate made sure to tie up all the ends perfectly, is something you would never imagine. Because what she did in the end, was so unexpected, so desperate, that not even I, the most wounded in this story, was able to predict it. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not and will never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry harsh truths. Betrayal corrodes, destroys families and leaves deep scars. Our goal is to show, through fiction, the real consequences that infidelity can cause. Get ready now to dive into an intense story, full of emotions, and twists that will leave you breathless. Take a deep breath. The story begins now. At the center of a meticulously constructed life, lived Daniel, a man with soft speech, discreet gestures and a generous soul, who had never learned to fake what he felt. At 41 years old, he was the picture of stability, a respected professional in the field of civil engineering, owner of a small construction company that he had founded with effort over 2 decades. He worked with passion, but never allowed professional commitments to take the place of what he considered his true asset, his family. With a calm look, he was one of those men who seemed to have been born to care, to support others in silence, while slowly fading away to see them shine. His life followed an almost poetic rhythm, like a symphony of routine and comfort, and he liked to believe that happiness lay there, coming home, seeing the kitchen light on, hearing laughter coming from the bedroom and sharing the sofa with those he chose to grow old alongside. Beside him, there was Laura. With delicate beauty, a soft smile and an analytical look, she was an intelligent, observant woman who always demonstrated an impressive sense of self-control. With a degree in psychology, she had worked for years with school guidance, but recently preferred to dedicate herself to more personal projects, reading, crafts, gardening. She wasn't exactly an excessively affectionate woman, but she showed affection in discreet, subtle gestures, like preparing Daniel's favorite coffee on Saturday mornings, or organizing the bookshelf by color just to see his satisfied smile. The two had been married for 16 years. They had no children, but they created a bond together that, to everyone's eyes, seemed solid, real, mature. They were the type of couple that inspired confidence, that seemed to have overcome the tests of time, the curves of living together, the wear and tear of routine. They lived in a large house, surrounded by a well-kept garden that Laura watered religiously every afternoon. The house itself was a reflection of both, simple, elegant, welcoming. With walls in neutral tones, books stacked in every corner and framed travel photos scattered around the room, every corner exuded memory, history, belonging. On Sundays, they used to walk to the bakery together, buy fresh bread and fruit and return hand in hand like two teenagers on a date. There was a connection between them that needed no words, a silent language shared naturally. The looks were enough. The gestures were understood. The silences didn't matter. Daniel was the type who spoke little and listened a lot. Friends described him as someone of rare integrity, loyal to the bone. He never raised his voice, never shied away from a difficult conversation, nor did he let small discussions escalate into larger proportions. He believed that love is measured in small everyday decisions, in the willingness to choose the other even when it would be easier to run away. Therefore, he never had any doubts about Laura. He trusted her with the naturalness of someone trusting the sunrise. He was not a man given to paranoia or gratuitous suspicion. He believed in reciprocity as a pillar of any relationship. And he believed, most of all, that they were made for each other. Laura, in turn, was a practical woman. He valued stability, order, the predictability of things. She liked to have everything under control, and she was careful with time, schedules, and details. I planned birthdays in advance, knew exactly where every document in the house was, made grocery lists and kept the closets always organized by categories. This precision enchanted Daniel at the beginning of the relationship. He, more disorganized, found in her the balance his world was missing. Already she, tired of broken promises and fragile loves of the past, saw in Daniel a safe haven, someone reliable, stable, constant. They completed each other. From the outside, it was the type of relationship that generated good envy. Discreet, elegant, silent and durable. At family lunches, they were always the last to argue. They preferred to observe. Laura knew that everyone expected her to take the lead in conversations, with her slow speech and precise opinion. Daniel was more observant, he laughed little, but always at the right time, like someone who is more interested in understanding than in being understood. They had few close friends, but those they did have were loyal. And they even swore they had never met a couple so connected, so aware of the choices they had made. No one imagined, not even remotely, that something could shake that structure. On social media, they rarely published anything. They were not the type to expose their lives for public approval. But the few times they appeared together, what was seen were genuine smiles, looks of complicity, gestures of sincere affection. They celebrated wedding anniversaries with discreet dinners, trips to quiet places, and exchanges of handwritten letters. In one of these letters, kept carefully in his nightstand drawer, Daniel had written, "If I ever forget who I am, I hope I still remember who we are together." This was the type of love they believed they cultivated. But time is a silent sculptor, transforming faces, sculpting habits and rearranging priorities. And as the years went by, small changes began to emerge. Laura started sleeping later, citing insomnia. Daniel, tired of the work routine and tight deadlines, slept earlier and earlier. The conversations, previously full of enthusiasm, began to become shorter and more practical. And weekends became quieter. There was still affection, of course. There was still kindness. But something invisible settled between them, a subtle, almost imperceptible distance, like a transparent veil that separates two people without them realizing it. Daniel noticed that Laura was more distracted, more absent, but he preferred to believe it was tiredness. And Laura, in turn, felt emotionally alone, although she never had the courage to say it out loud. Both, in their own way, tried to convince themselves that it was just a phase. That everything would go back to normal. It was in this scenario that, slowly, the cracks began to appear. Not big cracks, but small gaps. Daniel started arriving home earlier, as if trying to make up for lost time. Laura started going out with old friends, resuming a social life that she had left aside. Each person sought, in their own way, to find something they didn't even know they had lost. And yet, they maintained the same ritual as always. The good morning at breakfast, the kiss before bed, the little routine care. But there was tension in the air. A discomfort that could not be explained. A silent restlessness that Daniel felt in the coldest touch, in the most distant gaze, in the shallowest breath in sleepless dawns. In the eyes of others, nothing had changed. They continued to be the same admired, respected, almost unshakable couple. But inside the house, gestures started to have more weight. An "okay" sounded like an armed question. A silence, like a scream. And what was once predictable now became uncertain. Daniel no longer knew whether Laura was laughing for real or out of politeness. And Laura no longer knew if his affection was spontaneous or an effort to maintain something that was beginning to lose color. But neither of them had the courage to talk about it. It was easier to follow. Keep up appearances. Preserve what was left of the stability they built with so much zeal. Even so, there were attempts. Impromptu dinners, flowers left on the table, little surprises. And on good days, they would laugh again. On good days, they looked at each other as before. But the good days were less frequent. And the bad ones, longer. There was still love. But they no longer knew if there was a desire. There was still respect. But the enthusiasm, that sparkle in the eyes, seemed to have remained somewhere in the timeline that they no longer knew how to access. And it was in that silent space, between the love that still existed and the desire that began to die, that something began to move. A silent choice. A false step. A look beyond the line. Nothing blatant. Nothing explicit. Just the beginning of something. Something small. Almost invisible. But it would soon become impossible to hide. Now, the doubt arises, what exactly began to change in that silent house, where every word seemed measured, every gesture rehearsed? What moves behind closed doors, when two eyes meet, but they no longer recognize each other? And how far will someone go to protect a lie they swore was love? On the third Monday of that month, Daniel arrived home earlier than usual, after a last-minute cancelled meeting at the construction company's office. With his mind still occupied by the details of a new project he was budgeting, he left the keys on the sideboard and felt a strange emptiness in the room. The smell of the apple cake Laura used to make on Mondays wasn't there. The television in the living room, which she left on even without watching, was off. He climbed the stairs in silence, attentive, as if something in his instinct was already trying to warn him of an imminent rupture, although he himself didn't yet know what. In the room, nothing was out of place, but the bed was impeccably made, as if it hadn't been used all day. In the bathroom, no damp towels, no trace of recent presence. He descended again, the uneasiness growing like a dull noise. In the kitchen, a simple note, I went out to sort out a few things, I'll be back in the late afternoon. Kisses. There was something about that sentence that didn't fit. It wasn't the content, it was the tone. The kiss seemed cold, mechanical. The lyrics were more hurried, without the delicate loops she used to make in the hell. But Daniel took a deep breath and pushed the thoughts away. He was tired and probably projecting unfounded insecurities. He tried to occupy himself with small tasks around the house, checked emails, answered messages from the office. Still, the clock didn't seem to cooperate, and each minute dragged by with unbearable slowness. At 8 p.m., Laura still hadn't returned. He did not leave a message, did not respond to the message sent at 6:35 p.m. The cell phone rang until it went to voicemail. Daniel, uncomfortable, but still trying to rationalize, opened his notebook and went back to work. At 9:14 p.m., she finally walked through the door with a subtle smile, saying that she had lost herself in time at a cafe with a college friend she hadn't seen in years. The explanation was too convincing. So convincing that it seemed rehearsed. Daniel didn't argue, he just nodded, observing every detail of her face as he spoke. Her eyes didn't avoid his, but they didn't seek depth either. It was as if she was fulfilling a performance, an obligation. After that, similar episodes began to repeat themselves with uncomfortable frequency. Laura started going out more, always with reasonable excuses, always with a controlled smile on her lips. The conversations, increasingly brief. Dinners are quieter. Daniel began to notice small details, and it was these that created a crack in his certainty. The new bracelet that she started wearing and that she said she got from a friend. The perfume that appeared in the bathroom, different from the one I had used for years. She read and responded to the messages quickly, turning the phone face down immediately afterwards. A different, lighter laugh that escaped in moments disconnected from the reality of the house. And, above all, the look that was once just for him, was now lost in absences that he could no longer reach. Suspicion grew like a shadow within him, fueled by the lack of convincing explanations and the heavy silence between the two. Daniel was not the type to accuse without proof. But he wasn't naive either. He began to move silently. He reorganized his routine to observe better. I wrote down the times she went out, the places she said she frequented. Once, she decided to check if the friend she mentioned actually existed, and discovered that she was in another city. From that point on, something inside him broke. There was no longer room for doubt, only for the bitter realization that something was deeply wrong. One Friday, he said he would travel for work, but remained in the city. He rented an ordinary car, exchanged his cell phone chip for a disposable number and started following Laura's footsteps with the precision of someone who no longer wanted to be deceived. There was no satisfaction in it, only pain. Pain for every confirmation, for every minute wasted on lies, for every time she smiled at someone else as if that smile were an extension of herself. It was 3 days of observant silence until the final moment, a Saturday night, when he saw her enter a reserved neighborhood restaurant, with low lights and an intimate atmosphere. She looked beautiful. So beautiful that he almost wanted to believe it was just an ordinary dinner. But when another man stood up and greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, followed by a lingering touch on the waist, Daniel felt his heart shrink. He wasn't a friend. It wasn't a casual encounter. It was intimacy. He watched the two of them from the sidewalk across the street, invisible to their reality, his hands shaking and his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him like a film of personal tragedy. Inside, a hurricane was brewing. But on the outside, he remained motionless, firm, as if frozen in time. He watched dinner until the end. He saw the smiles, the toasts, the discreet touches. He followed the car to a commercial building, where the two disappeared through the back door, as if they already knew the place. Daniel didn't enter. There was no need. What he saw there was enough to destroy the image he had of his own marriage. That night, he didn't sleep. He didn't cry. He just remained motionless in his armchair, staring at the office ceiling, trying to understand how two bodies could live together for so long and still walk through such distant worlds. When Laura returned home late the next morning, she had flowers and a rehearsed apology on her lips. He said he had slept at a friend's house, a pathetic, empty excuse that he listened to in silence. But he didn't confront it. Not yet. He knew it wasn't just about betrayal. There was something bigger behind it. Something that had not yet been revealed. In the following days, Laura continued to play her role perfectly. Smiles at breakfast, phone calls made in the kitchen, long afternoons of supposed social engagements. And Daniel, now awake, continued to study every movement, every breath, every detail hidden between the lines. His eyes no longer saw his wife, they saw a woman he loved and who, now, he observed with the coldness of an investigator analyzing a crime scene. The difference was that, in this case, the crime was against him. And the scene was his own home. On a Wednesday night, Laura went out once again under the excuse of a networking event. Daniel didn't follow her. He sat at the dining table and looked at the empty plate in front of him, feeling that space symbolized more than physical absence, it was a portrait of the emotional absence that had settled between them. When she returned, her voice had the practiced softness of someone trying not to arouse suspicion. But he knew. I already knew everything. I knew where she had been, who she had been with, what they had done. He even knew the other man's name. I already had your social networks, I knew where you worked, your marital status, your preferences. And the most ironic thing, I knew that this man, apparently so confident, had something to hide. Something that, by a twist of fate, would become a crucial piece in the story that Daniel was about to write. That morning, when Laura was sleeping soundly next to him, he watched her face with a strange mixture of anger, sadness and compassion. He wondered how they got to that point. What they had lost along the way. And, more than that, what was still to lose. But it was not time for answers. It was time for action. Silently, he began to hatch a plan. Not to punish her. But to recover your dignity, your peace, your life. And, who knows, rebuild the truth from the rubble of lies. Because if Laura thought he would remain silent, resigned, deceived, she was about to discover how much she underestimated the man with whom she had shared the last 16 years. And what he discovered about his lover, would change absolutely everything. That Saturday morning, the sky was overcast and heavy, as if it sensed that something serious was hanging in the air. Daniel woke up early, more out of habit than necessity, and spent long minutes just watching the ceiling of the room, listening to Laura's soft breathing beside him. There was a false calm in that stillness, like the moment before a storm breaks. He got up slowly, crossed the corridor and went to the office, where everything was already prepared for what would come next. Every detail had been thought out with millimeter precision. There was a folder with documents, images, printed messages, schedules with dates and times, call logs, copies of emails. It wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about what the betrayal had revealed to him. Daniel wasn't just a wounded husband. He was now a man in possession of a truth that could destroy more than one marriage, could ruin reputations, lives, families. Laura woke up shortly after, in an unusually light mood, as if that Saturday was just another ordinary day in their lives. He prepared coffee, placed fruit on the table, cut the bread delicately. When Daniel entered the kitchen, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, natural, mechanical, like someone who still believes that the lie is under control. He sat down, watched her meticulous movement as she prepared the table for a moment, and, in a firm but calm voice, said that they needed to talk. Laura hesitated for a second, but nodded. Maybe because she believed that the confrontation would finally come, maybe because she thought she was ready to play the role of the repentant woman. But what happened next dismantled any script she might have rehearsed. They sat in the living room. Daniel placed the folder on the coffee table and pushed it towards her. He just said to open it, without further words. Laura, with shaking hands, pulled out the papers and leafed through them. Each page, a stab. Each image, irrefutable proof. She tried to speak, justify, mumbled something about loneliness, about difficult times, but he raised his hand and asked for silence. He said it wasn't about that. That he already knew. That she could guard the theater. What he wanted now was for her to listen. And what he had to say wasn't about feelings, hurt or guilt. It was about consequences. And, more than that, about the truth that she had no idea he had discovered. He got up and walked slowly to the window, as if he needed to take a deep breath before tearing off the final veil of that performance. He said that when he investigated the man she cheated on him with, he discovered something beyond secret messages and meetings. He discovered a link. A name. A detail buried in the past, that she never expected to come to light. Laura, confused, tried to argue, but he continued. She said that her lover, the one she said was just a new friend who made her feel alive again, was someone she had known for much longer than she said. A name that appeared in old email records, forgotten registrations, contact lists. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't recent. And it wasn't just an adventure. Daniel then took a separate, smaller, heavier envelope and handed it to her. Inside, There was a copy of the articles of incorporation of the company where the lover worked, a company in which Daniel had been a partner in the past. They had broken off their partnership after an internal scandal that was suppressed by legal agreements, from which Daniel had emerged with controlled losses, but with deep hurt. And now, here was that man again in her life, not by coincidence, but by strategy. Laura's eyes widened and she began to shake her head, but the final blow was yet to come. Daniel asked calmly how long she had known who that man really was. Laura, stunned, replied that she didn't know. He said that he had met him by chance, that he had no idea of the connection with the past. Daniel, without raising his voice, just pulled another sheet from the folder. A printed email. An exchange of messages between her and her lover, dating from before the start of the affair, where they spoke openly about Daniel. They planned meetings, tested ways to provoke him, even discussed how to manipulate the narrative so that, if one day they were discovered, they could reverse roles and make him seem like the distant, absent, emotionally neglectful husband. It was a plan. A cold, premeditated plan that mixed desire with calculation. Laura, pale, let the paper fall from her hands. She tried to explain herself, now with her voice breaking, saying that everything started harmlessly, that there was no intention to hurt, that everything got out of control. But Daniel no longer listened as a husband. His look was that of someone who watched, with painful lucidity, the total deconstruction of a story that he once believed to be real. I told her that this was no longer about betrayal, but about manipulation, about a lack of character, about the conscious destruction of someone I trusted. And that the worst part of it all was not the physical infidelity, but the cowardly effort to break a man inside. Laura started to cry. For the first time, not in a performative way, but with genuine desperation. She tried to get closer, but he backed away. He said he no longer needed explanations. That there was no more room for requests for forgiveness. That any trace of what they once were died there. And before she could say anything else, he delivered one last letter, this time written by hand. It was a letter addressed to the lover's wife. Telling everything. With attached proofs. With dates, names, times. With the truth. He said he had already sent a digital copy. And that the woman now knew everything. And more, that she was also part of a plan. Laura screamed. Tried to stop it. She begged her not to do that, that she could solve everything, that she could put an end to the story, that they could still save something. But Daniel just looked at her, with a serenity that came from the pain that no longer hurt, and said that what he needed to save, he had already rescued, himself. And now she was the one who would have to deal with the consequences of her own choice. The sound of her crying echoed through the room as he headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned around and said that he didn't feel hate, but that he didn't feel anything else either. And that, in the end, was the real punishment. For her. That same day, while Laura locked herself in the house trying to control the damage, her lover's wife did what many did not expect. He appeared at their workplace, with the letter in hand, and publicly explained what had happened. The news spread like wildfire. The lover was removed from the company, lost contracts, and had his name involved in ethical scandals. And Laura. Laura saw, one by one, her pillars crumble. The reputation, the marriage, the image of a balanced and rational woman. All he was left with was the echo of a choice made in secret, and now revealed in the light of day. Daniel, in turn, didn't look back. He traveled out of town, turned off his phones, broke off social networks, started over. Not as a victim, but as someone who has learned that silence can be the most powerful weapon against betrayal. And that the truth, when revealed at the right time, has the power to destroy lies with surgical precision. What he still didn't know, and what would only come to light weeks later, was that his lover's plan involved much more than desire and manipulation. There was something hidden that neither of them could predict. And that final revelation was yet to come. A revelation that would change more than relationships. I would change destinies. The morning after the confrontation, Daniel left the city without leaving any warning. He only took with him a backpack with simple clothes, his notebook and a folder with the documents he needed to process the divorce. He didn't call anyone, he didn't answer any of Laura's dozens of messages, and he didn't even open the emails she insisted on sending with titles like, "We need to talk," "It wasn't like that," or "Please read this." He knew the time was now his. Every step from then on would no longer be negotiated. He led his life like a man who picked up his own pieces, not to rebuild himself the same, but to shape something completely new. He drove for hours until he arrived at a rustic inn on the edge of a lake, surrounded by mountains and silence. The place was calm, almost untouched. There, among trees and fog, he allowed himself the luxury of feeling something close to peace. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing around that resembled Laura. No trace of the past. Only the present. And the urgent need to understand what to do with everything he was now carrying. Meanwhile, in the house where they lived, Laura was desperately trying to contain the fire that she herself had started. The lover's wife, who now knew absolutely everything, made a point of taking the story to the company where her husband worked, but not in a public way, in a subtle, elegant and deadly way. He sent a detailed letter to the board of directors, attaching irrefutable evidence that the highest-rated employee in the company's expansion area used the company's resources for personal meetings and data manipulation. The response was immediate. He was removed and, less than a week later, fired. His name no longer appears on any leadership list. Invitations to events have disappeared. Important contacts, who previously responded enthusiastically, became silent. The wife, in absolute silence since the revelation, did not look for Laura. There was no threat, no direct confrontation. Just an impersonal message, that she shouldn't expect anything more than what she already had, and that, from now on, she would face the consequences alone. Laura couldn't stand the isolation. He tried to rebuild his routine, resumed activities at the therapeutic center where he participated in events and discussion circles, but now the looks were different. There was no longer that subtle respect with which she was previously received. There was silence, judgment, and a strange form of pity. He tried to schedule sessions with former professional colleagues to talk and seek support, but the answers were evasive. Her support network evaporated before her eyes, and she knew exactly why. The extramarital affair would have been enough to cause damage, but her involvement in a plan against her own husband was what sealed her fate. That went beyond the realm of human error. It was betrayal with poison. And now that poison was coming back against her with a force that not even in the worst-case scenarios she had considered. It was late afternoon that Laura found the courage to look for Daniel's old partner. The man who, she now knew, had been the victim of his lover's manipulation and abandonment. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand why everything had gotten out of control. She called 3 times until she was able to be answered. The conversation was brief and cutting. He said he never loved her. That she was a means. A target. And that everything they experienced, all the meetings, promises, exchanges of confidences, were nothing more than a greater plan to ruin Daniel. A plan that was born years before, still in the times of the broken society, when Daniel discovered fraud in the company's balance sheets and forced his departure. The humiliation that the former partner felt at that time has never been overcome. The man wanted revenge and saw Laura as a perfect tool. She, needy, emotionally distant from her husband, was vulnerable. All it took was a few subtle thrusts, a few calculated glances, and she fell. And the worst part, he fell into believing that it was love. When Laura heard this, she felt the ground slip away from her feet. He laughed on the phone. He said that, in the end, Daniel was the only one who made it out in one piece. That he, the traitor, had lost everything, job, reputation, stability. But even so, he felt pleasure in knowing that Laura was now grieving something that was never real. He said he expected her to suffer a lot, because she was foolish enough to think she could manipulate someone as honest as Daniel. She hung up the phone in shock. This was no longer just loss. It was ruin. The feeling of being used, of having been a puppet in the hands of a man she believed she loved, was unbearable. The betrayal he committed now came back double. And Daniel's silence, more than any scream, was what hurt the most. Meanwhile, in the chalet between the mountains, Daniel was walking along the lakeside with a notebook in hand. I wrote loose thoughts, letters that I might never deliver, plans for an uncertain future. The pain was still there, but there was also a serene clarity. He didn't wish Laura harm. He did not seek destruction. I just wanted distance. He wanted to preserve what was left of himself. In one of the notes written in firm handwriting, he reflected, "The pain they caused me will not be the foundation of my new life. I want something pure, built on the truth, even if it takes me longer." That night, he made himself a strong coffee, sat on the porch, and opened the last message Laura had sent. It was a long letter. She spoke of guilt, of regret, of how she was manipulated, of how she let herself be carried away by an internal emptiness that she never knew how to name. She said that she had never stopped loving him, that she felt lost, and that now, more than ever, she understood how much she had hurt him. But the end of the letter was not a request for forgiveness. It was a plea. She wanted to see him. Just once. He said he didn't expect to get back together, nor justify it, but he needed to look him in the eye and apologize for everything. One last time. Daniel thought. He didn't know if it was right, but he responded with a date and place. A discreet café, where they used to go at the beginning of their marriage. Nothing symbolic. Neutral only. When Laura arrived, days later, she was dressed simply, discreetly, her eyes tired, her shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of months condensed into weeks. He was already there. Sitting, coffee in hand, without a defined expression. She approached and, for long seconds, they were silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "I said I wouldn't ask him to come back. That he knew he had crossed all limits and that not all the guilt in the world could change what was done." She said she was trying to understand how she lost herself. How he ignored such clear signs that he was about to destroy everything. He listened to her. Without interrupting, without judging. When she finished, her eyes already red, he just took a deep breath and replied that he still didn't know what he would do with all that. That he didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive her. But for now, he accepted his words. And that he wanted her to find peace. Because he was finally starting to find his own. They stood up, shook hands gently, and Laura left the café with tears in her eyes, knowing that this was the end of everything she had dreamed of rebuilding. Daniel stayed there for a few more minutes, watching the steam rise from the cup. There was something liberating about that scene. Something that didn't involve anger or hurt. Just a silent understanding that some stories end before they are even wrapped up. And that, sometimes, the real climax is not the explosion, but the silence that comes after it. However, something still remained. An element had not yet been placed on the table. Something that, even with all the destruction, still needed to be said. A connection made at the end of that night would once again change everyone's trajectory. It wasn't Laura. It was someone Daniel never expected to hear from again. And that voice, on the other end of the line, would bring no more pain, but a truth even more complex, and surprising, than anything I had ever faced before. Daniel remained in the café until long after Laura left, his gaze fixed on some point in the window, while time seemed to flow slowly around him. The steam from the coffee had disappeared, but the heat of the conversation still pulsed within him with a silent intensity. There was something strange about that moment. It wasn't peace, nor was it torment. It was a kind of suspension, an emotional limbo between the end of one story and the beginning of another that didn't yet know how it would begin. He didn't cry, he didn't smile, he didn't feel relief, nor anger. It was as if the body had used up all possible emotions in the last few days and now operated only on automatic, without reactions. Laura's words echoed in his mind, not because they touched him, but because they carried a weight that, even though he no longer wanted to carry it, was still attached to her name. A faint pain, which no longer screamed, but still whispered in the distance. That same night, already at the chalet, when the sky was clear and the wind cut through the trees with an almost anesthetic tranquility, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but Daniel answered, driven by a strange intuition, a feeling that the call wasn't just another attempt to contact Laura. And in fact, it wasn't. The voice on the other end was feminine, firm and polite, but with a controlled urgency that betrayed that something serious was about to be said. It was Clara, the ex-partner's wife, the one who had been deceived, betrayed, used, just like him. She was grateful for the courage he had in telling the truth, for the evidence he had sent, for the clarity with which he acted in the face of chaos. But after that, his voice changed. It became more serious, more personal. And then she revealed that there was something he might not have known, something that, even in the midst of all the devastation, had not been said. Clara explained that, weeks before everything came to light, she had already discovered part of her husband's infidelity. Not with Laura, but with other women, with employees of the company itself, with clients, with women who, unlike Laura, were coerced, manipulated, tricked into silence. And she, upon realizing the pattern of behavior and the risk it represented, had begun to silently document every movement, every email, every payment made outside the company's spreadsheet. She was gathering evidence, preparing a dossier. But what she didn't expect was that Laura, upon entering that cycle, would end up being just another used piece. The man had also lied to her, promising that he would leave everything behind to start over with a woman who supposedly knew what she wanted. But Daniel needed to know that behind that revenge game between the two men, there was a woman with a greater thirst for justice than any of them. Clara wanted him to know that he was not alone in his search for truth. And more than that, that the ex-partner, in desperation, had tried to blame him internally for his own downfall, saying that Daniel had set everything up, that he had manipulated Laura, that it was all just a defamation plan. And that's why she had made a point of handing over to the company's board not only Laura's emails and evidence of infidelity, but also the previous records, the omitted affairs, the victims who were previously afraid to speak out. She had initiated criminal proceedings for harassment, and now, in addition to being fired, he faced an official investigation, with a real risk of arrest and banishment from the market. She said this coldly. Not angry. With a sense of justice that Daniel immediately respected. When he hung up, he stared into space for a long time, processing that information. That story, which he thought he had ended with dignity and silence, was far from over. It was no longer just a marital tragedy. It was a tangle of betrayals, abuses of power, emotional and moral manipulations. It was a labyrinth where each corridor hid a new character deviation. And in the middle of it all, there was him, trying not to lose what was left of himself. The connection with Clara awakened something inside him that he didn't know he still had, a sense of responsibility greater than his own pain. He began to consider that perhaps there was something to do with all this. That the suffering he experienced should not only mark him, but transform him. That it could, in some way, be an agent of change for other people who might never have the courage to leave destructive relationships like the one Clara experienced. Over the next few days, Daniel slowly returned to the city. Not to see Laura, not to renew ties, but to take care of the legal processes. The division of the assets was already underway, the lawyer taking care of the details with a precision that gave him security. The house, which meant so much, would be sold. Neither of them wanted to be with her. It was too contaminated a space to house any attempt at a fresh start. Laura has temporarily moved in with a distant cousin. Daniel rented a small apartment in a residential neighborhood, with little furniture and lots of natural light. It was everything he needed, space, simplicity, and silence. There, little by little, he began to breathe again. He started running in the park in the morning, started writing in his notebook again, and frequented bookstores and quiet cafes. He rediscovered the pleasure of solitude well lived. In one of these cafes, he met Sophia. A woman with an easy laugh and an intelligent look, who worked as a graphic designer and had a similar taste in music to his. They started talking about books, then movies, then life. She was different from Laura in almost everything, except her passion for details. But in Sophia there was something light, unrehearsed, unconditioned. She was a woman who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, who didn't mince words to please, who listened carefully and responded authentically. Daniel didn't fall in love right away. It was too early. But there was a possibility, a ray of light, a silent hope that there were still possible encounters after the storm. Meanwhile, Laura faced total emptying. Friends moved away, projects were interrupted, the image of a stable and rational woman that she cultivated with so much zeal dissolved with each new whisper around her. She tried to resume her practice as a psychologist, but there was no more confidence. The ethics that he had always defended in lectures and articles were now being scrutinized. He lost the respect of his colleagues, the trust of his patients, the support of his family. Not because she cheated on her husband, but for lying so coldly. For having manipulated. For having been an accomplice to a plan. The judgment did not come from the moralistic society, but from the disappointment of those who saw it as an example. I spent my days trying to create a new routine, but everything was heavy, forced. She started writing letters to herself, trying to understand how she got there. The harshest one just said, "I destroyed everything." And the worst thing is that I understood it too late. Daniel, in turn, no longer harbored anger. I thought of her from a distance, like someone looking at an old photograph and no longer recognizing the look of the person next to them. It still carried marks. There were still nights when I woke up with a heavy heart, imagining what it would have been like if everything had been different. But those nights were increasingly rare. And in its place came brighter mornings, with the sound of the kettle boiling, with the calm presence of someone who, without promising anything, was just there, sharing the now. Clara, after the formal complaint, decided to move to another state with her children. He wanted to start over, away from the scandal, away from the shadow of the man who once swore to protect his family. She sent one last message to Daniel, saying that if he ever needed anything, she would be available. He said their pain had been different, but that they had both come out stronger. And thanked him again. Not because of the exposure of the case, but because of the courage of breaking the silence. Life went on. Not the way you plan, but how you learn to allow. Daniel didn't look for happy endings. I was looking for truths. And now, on the threshold of a new phase, I knew that the hardest part had already passed. But there was still one last arrangement to be made. A choice he needed to face. An invitation left in your inbox from Laura with the title, "I need to tell you the full truth." And the truth, as he had learned, never came in parts. She always took her toll. The email sent by Laura remained in the inbox for 2 days before Daniel took any action. The dry, almost impersonal title contradicted the content he imagined to be inside. "I need to tell the complete truth" was an invitation that, at that point, seemed more like a last attempt to regain control over the damage of the past than a sincere gesture of redemption. He had already learned, at the cost of deep insights, that the truth never arrives cleanly, that the final version of the facts, when told late, no longer has the power to repair anything, but can, in very rare cases, just end a cycle. And he was ready for it, closure. Nothing more. I didn't look for explanations, I didn't want any fixes. What she perhaps wanted, deep down, was to see how far she was capable of going when there was no longer a stage or an audience. On the morning of the 3rd day, he responded. He arranged a meeting in a public square, not for safety, but because he wanted to distance himself from the intimate atmosphere that closed environments could generate. I wanted to keep the concrete floor underfoot, the sound of random voices around, the coming and going of strangers as silent witnesses. Laura arrived punctually, and there was a restrained uneasiness in her posture. She was visibly downcast, not because of her appearance itself, but because of the way she seemed out of place in her own body, as if she no longer knew where to put her hands, her eyes, her voice. She sat across from him and didn't smile. The formality between the two was brutal, like two strangers who carry common memories but share nothing but the past. She began by saying that what she would reveal was not a justification. Who knew that any attempt at an apology now would be pathetic, disrespectful? He said that what he was about to tell had been postponed for years. That she buried the truth so many times that, at a certain point, she began to believe she would never need to dig it out. But now, after everything that had been destroyed, that still weighed more than all subsequent mistakes. Daniel didn't say a word. He just nodded, taking his time. Laura took a deep breath and, with a choked voice, revealed that she met his ex-partner much earlier than Daniel imagined. Not just before the extramarital affair, but even before the separation between the two men in the old society. She said that, at the time, she worked as an informal consultant in a private clinic, a voluntary project that she combined with her old career. And that was where the man appeared for the first time, introduced as an investor. He seemed kind, interested in mental health, and a defender of the appreciation of professionals in the field. Little by little, she got closer with engaging arguments, sad personal stories, and with a way that made her feel seen. Laura didn't tell anyone. Not even Daniel. He said that there was no physical contact at that moment, but that the emotional connection was established strongly. When he discovered that he was Daniel's partner, he felt shame, fear and confusion. But that didn't break the relationship. And that this initial omission was the real turning point. Daniel listened to her with an empty look, but an attentive mind. It was a timeline that he had already reconstructed in part, but never in detail. Laura continued saying that the former partner used her to obtain veiled information about Daniel, about his weaknesses, his routine, his wear and tear. That there was a subtle exchange of trust there, a type of sophisticated emotional manipulation that she only came to understand much later. He said that he had not cheated on him physically at that time, but that, emotionally, he had already crossed boundaries that he now recognized as betrayal in its most primitive form. When the partnership collapsed and the former partner was removed, Laura believed that everything would be in the past. That he had buried it with silence and that nothing would come back to the surface. But the years passed and, when they met again by chance at a business fair, the cycle reopened with violence. She didn't resist. And when he gave in to the first intimate encounter, there were no longer any barriers. What she meant, in the end, was that this wasn't just an impulsive case of neediness or emotional distraction. It was an old, neglected, silently nurtured building that had become unmanageable. Laura said, with teary eyes, that she no longer knew who she was at that time. Who lost herself so much trying to be the ideal woman, the balanced wife, the ethical professional, that, at the first sign of directed attention, she collapsed inside. And that didn't justify anything, but perhaps it explained why everything turned out the way it did. Daniel watched her as if seeing her for the last time. Not because he hated it, but because he understood that there was nothing more to be said. And that's exactly what he responded, that he understood, but that he didn't need that truth to follow. That her, by telling him all that now, only confirmed what he already knew instinctively, that the mistake was not the betrayal itself, but the decision to maintain a farce when there was time to fix it. He stood up, thanked her for the meeting and wished she could find peace. He said it with a sincerity that completely disarmed her. Laura tried to say goodbye with a hug, but Daniel elegantly retreated. He waved and walked away along the gravel path of the square, with firm steps and calm breathing. There was no more pain. There was understanding. And understanding, contrary to what many believe, does not bring closer, it frees. In the following days, Daniel resumed his routine with renewed lightness. He started going out with Sophia more frequently, now no longer like someone walking on ruins, but like someone stepping on solid ground. She respected your time, didn't ask unnecessary questions or put emotional pressure on you. It was an honest start. One night, as they walked through a street market, she held his hand and smiled, saying he felt lighter. Daniel laughed, not because he was completely happy, but because he knew he was finally whole. Meanwhile, Laura began a deep therapeutic process. Not to win Daniel back, she knew that was impossible, but to try to understand where she began to destroy herself. She started writing about her experiences, not as a way of defending herself, but as an attempt to warn other women about the danger of self-effacement disguised as perfection. He sent some texts to independent magazines, and to his surprise, he received responses. He started writing frequently, sharing pains, mistakes, reconstructions. Not as a victim, but as someone who admits that they destroyed it and is now trying to clean up the pieces with their own hands. I was still judged, I was still looked at with suspicion. But he began, little by little, to understand that perhaps his mission now was precisely this, to live with the responsibility of never repeating his own mistakes. Daniel and Laura's stories went in opposite but parallel directions. He, rebuilding his life in silence, cultivating light bonds, discovering that love does not need to be accompanied by pain to be true. She, facing the weight of the choices made, slowly walking towards a more honest version of herself. There was dignity in both paths. And even without reconciliation, without formalized forgiveness, there was something peaceful in the way fate resettled them on their own paths. But not everything was over. A phone call from Daniel's law office provided one last piece to the puzzle. A document sent by the company that was previously run by the former partner involved with Laura. A request for judicial retraction. A proposed agreement. A formal acknowledgement that some of the accusations leveled against Daniel in the past were built on false information. And there, among the attachments, a letter written in his own hand by the former partner. Brief, objective, cruel. I accepted the plan. He confessed that it all started with a feeling of humiliation when Daniel forced him to leave society. He said Laura was just a means. That the case was premeditated. And that the ruin he suffered now was just. He ended by saying that he did not ask for forgiveness. I just wanted to end the cycle. Daniel read the text with static eyes, like someone watching the last scene of a film who already knew the ending. The letter didn't shake him. He just closed the chapter with the necessary coolness. In the days that followed, Daniel burned the letter on the balcony of his apartment as the sky slowly darkened over the city. Not out of anger. But because I didn't want to keep anything from that past anymore. It was time to move on. And now, finally, I was ready for it. A new life awaited him. A light love, a possible peace. And the certainty that, even in the most painful stories, there is room for new beginnings that don't need an audience, just the truth. Time passed without fanfare, without important dates, without celebrations. It just passed, as it should be when you are rebuilding after a violent fall. Daniel did not need to announce his resumption, nor did he look for external validation. He made simplicity his refuge and discretion his strength. He was now a more restrained man, more attentive to the signs he previously ignored, more careful with his own limits. He followed Sophia's side, not with the idealized intensity of romance, but with an almost unprecedented lightness. He found in her a company that did not require masks, a shelter without charge, a woman who saw her scars without trying to heal them. She didn't try to fill gaps, she just sat next to them and waited for time to do what no one else could do, reorganize the pain. The relationship wasn't perfect, but it was true, and that, for Daniel, was enough. Your company restructured itself smoothly. It won new contracts, expanded partnerships and started employing a lean but loyal team. Daniel no longer exposed himself as he used to, he avoided corporate events and preferred meetings in discreet environments. He remained productive, respected, but away from the spotlight. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Little by little, he returned to forgotten hobbies, drawing again in the early hours of the morning, writing in unlined notebooks, visiting small places where no one recognized him. I found pleasure in simple routines, in the sound of boiling water, in the smell of bread coming out of the oven, in reading pages yellowed by time and neglect. He was, finally, a man at peace with his own history. Laura took a less gentle path. The decline was not just social or professional, it was internal. She needed months of intensive therapy to understand that her mistakes didn't just come from emotional deficiencies, but from a deep hole in her identity that she had been ignoring for decades. She was a woman shaped by image, by expectations, by a constant need for control and perfection. And when everything fell apart, what was left was what had never really been worked on, herself. She tried to put herself back on the market, but the judgmental look still followed her. He chose not to insist. He decided to change his field, started writing more frequently, published articles on emotional ethics, human fragility, and it was in this way, in vulnerability, that he rediscovered a form of connection with the world. He saw his story used as a reference in support groups, he heard women identifying with their falls, their weaknesses, their mistakes. It did not become a reference for overcoming. It became an alert. And somehow, that kept her upright. He never tried to get back in touch with Daniel again. He understood that there were borders that, once crossed, could no longer be crossed back. She kept with her the memory of his last look, cold and respectful, and knew that that was the definitive goodbye. He started to live in a small country town, where no one knew his story. He left the speeches ready and the polished texts behind. She lived almost anonymously, teaching creative writing to teenagers and tending to a small garden that she cultivated herself. He aged quickly, but with dignity. And although the guilt never completely disappeared, he learned to live with it without letting it destroy him. The former partner, in turn, followed the more predictable path. Jobless, reputationless, facing lawsuits for misconduct, he disappeared from the corporate scene. He tried to start new ventures, but his name was synonymous with scandal. He changed countries, renamed his CV, tried to reinvent himself under a new identity, but the digital age is unforgiving. The evidence was available, the public denunciations, the reports immortalized in networks and records. He began to live nomadically, running away more from himself than from justice. No woman stood by his side. No company wanted to risk its brand alongside his. He was left with the loneliness of the manipulator who fell into his own trap. He tried, in vain, to blame Daniel for his ruin, but no one listened to him anymore. His voice became an echo in corridors empty of credibility. Clara, on the other hand, rebuilt herself with admirable strength. Mother of 2 young children, she moved to another state, remaking her life in a city where the past didn't weigh so much. It has become a reference in protection policies for women victims of corporate harassment. He created an NGO, participated in committees, traveled the country giving lectures. He made pain a purpose. She became an ally of other Claras, women silenced by bonds of power, fear and dependence. He never entered into a romantic relationship again, not out of disappointment, but out of choice. He wanted to dedicate himself to his children and the mission he had found. In his room, there was a framed letter, the one Daniel sent when everything came to light. Not out of idolatry, but as a symbol that the truth, even when it destroys, liberates. As for Sophia, she didn't save Daniel. And he didn't even need to. She was just a whole woman, who appeared when he was ready to live something real. He saw in him the strength of someone who faced darkness without losing kindness. Together, they built something without rushing, without unattainable promises. He told his stories without victimization, she listened without judging. They laughed together at everyday nonsense, they faced silences with maturity. It was love, but a love without noise, without dependence. A love that grew in the arid land where there were once ruins. And, therefore, a stronger, more solid, more human love. Years later, Daniel returned to that square where he had his last conversation with Laura. He sat on the same bench, now with gray hair, a book in his hands and a serene expression. He observed the movement of people, the low flight of birds, the laughter of a child running across the playground. And there, in the midst of the most banal everyday life, he felt complete. Not happy in the romantic, idealized sense of the word, but complete. He knew what he lived, what he lost, what he achieved. I knew I wouldn't have gotten there if I hadn't gone through the storm. And I knew, more than anything, that I would never accept anything less than the truth again, even if it hurt. Now that you've come this far, tell me, what would you do if you were in Daniel's shoes? And for Laura, Would there be any chance of redemption? Comment below, I really want to know your opinion. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. There are a lot of realistic, impactful and emotional stories coming up. And just to remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, infidelity is shown for what it really is, destructive, painful, and fraught with consequences. Until the next story.